Welcome back to another episode of Disney Unpacked. It's me, Len Testa, and I've been told we're starting today's show by taking a look at an old, faded magazine article. Guys, from which dumpster did you dive to get this thing?
One man's treasure, another man's treasure, Len. This article was originally published in Look magazine back in January of 1955.
And this is a promo piece about the still under construction Disneyland, right?
That's all we get from you. That's it. You know, he'll give you a pile of gold and you just go, you just look at this date and that's all you care about. Wow. I'm so disappointed. Anyway, look, the important thing you need to focus on today is this article focuses on Fantasyland. And in my way of thinking, it features several great examples of, well, WDI's ideation process.
Mr. Shull, your creative works definitely impress me, but your use of $5 words does not.
Well, I can make change. I've got my coin changer right here.
I can make change. I can make change for the dumb ones among you, Mr. Testa.
Yeah, I can make change.
My God, I'm going to start saying that. That's great.
Look, the point is this, that is a good word, and it's used commonly in the hallways of WDI there in Glendale. I mean, I heard it 100 times if I heard it once. And basically, it's a big, as you said, a fancy word where people get together and explore ideas. Now, that's a point where things are just simply lines on paper. And that's what we're looking at now.
All right. And I'm assuming that this includes stuff that never makes it off the drawing board, because as I look at this article, I see a bunch of things like Monstro, the whale shoot-the-shoots that didn't make it into the final version of Disneyland, right?
Well, you're absolutely correct, but I heard a little bit of surprise in your voice. I mean, you should know by now, not every single idea that's ever thought about ever makes it off the page and into the parks. And, you know, it's like one idea out of every 10 actually gets built.
That is not a great batting average.
No, it's kind of a strikeout, to be honest with you. But, you know, that said, it's all part of the process of Disney Imagineering, and it always has been for well over 70 years. You step up, you take a swing, and sometimes you hit the ball out of the park, but not always. But in every case, I always learned was this: you always trust this process. Always trust the process.
Speaking of a far different design, what do you make of this?
Well, for starters, I can make a brooch or a tiara. No. Had to do it. Okay. All right. But, okay. Excuse me. I speak jive. No. All right. So, but on this version of this concept art, the Dumbo elephants are pink, but the ones in the park are gray, right? Were they always gray?
They are today.
Okay. Right.
But, you know, the poster that's at Disneyland, they're at the Anaheim train station. It promotes Disney to the Disneyland guests, the Dumbo the Flying Elephant. And as soon as they get over to Fantasyland, those guests, having seen the poster, well, they expect to see a fleet of flying pink pachyderms flying over Fantasyland.
I'm assuming that this is artistic license and not truth in advertising that you're going for here.
Oh, well, it's actually basically taking off the fact that, the inspiration originally for Bruce Bushman came from the pink elephants on parade sequence in the classic animated film Dumbo. I mean, that's what they wanted to do. And there are reasons we'll be talking about why they didn't do it.
But guys, if we could get back to this piece of Dumbo concept art from the Look magazine article, looking past the pink elephant, what I see is a different ride system than the one we have in the parks today.
Now, to quote the Look magazine article, on the flying Dumbo elephant ride, passengers will help steer their vehicle by manipulating the elephant's ears.
Wow, really? So this wasn't a joystick or a little lever that we've got now. You had to manipulate his ears? That's a crazy idea. Like, how would that even work?
Well, you know, the thing is, it worked the way the flyer would have worked. And it was a classic time-tested ride system, the flyer was. And as I said earlier, it worked everywhere. And you even can see them today. There's over one still operating at Knott's Berry Farm.
Okay, that actually does look like a lot of fun in a sort of like classic carnival midway type of thing. But so why didn't the Imagineers just go with this in the original Disneyland Land?
Well, I think the answer is in the name. The solution in the name. The answer is there in front of us. And effectively, it's this: when you look at the flyer, there's one wing, which is used to control the swing of the vehicle. But the wing is oriented like the sail of a ship. It's vertical, and there's one. And that's a problem when you have Dumbo, because he has not one, but two ears, and they're horizontal, not vertical. But as we know today, they couldn't do that with the flyer. They couldn't do it with the spider. But Walt really loved the idea, and Walt wasn't ready to let the idea go.
Wait, you mean the flapping ears?
Oh, I've heard rumors of this. So originally, weren't the ears in Dumbo supposed to flap?
Well, this is the story that they tell about the early days of Disneyland and how Walt wanted the ears on all of the elephant-shaped cars on the Dumbo ride to flap as guests flew through the air in Fantasyland.
It sounds like a super cool effect, but why didn't we get that, or why don't we have it now?
Oh, Len, they got it working. Oh, they most definitely did. And for that, I offer up this image as proof.
Holy cow. Look at those Dumbos. Their ears, some of the ears are definitely in the up position, and some are definitely in the down position.
You know what this reminds me of? A 1984 Pontiac Fiero with one headlight up. I think there's some sort of mechanical hereditary thing going on here. All right, go ahead.
Yeah, well, the very thing, though, you talked about was the fact that, well, in order to do it, they had to have this really big industrial ugly hinge mechanism, and it was bolted into the side of Dumbo's head. I know. There's one on both sides.
So I figured, once you start changing the axis of orientation, you end up with more complex gearing. So what ended up happening here? Why didn't we get this?
Well, Dumbo started out as a very cute little elephant, but he also had a very strong weight problem. Once you added this enormous mechanism in order to have the guests control the air orientation to make the vehicle rise up and down, well, there were consequences. And the consequence was that the Dumbo ride vehicle was only supposed to weigh 500 pounds. Each.
Okay, the ride vehicle itself, 500 pounds. Okay,
that's it. That's the math. Now we're working from the math. And this meant that each of these hydraulic boom arms then could be safely lift a ride vehicle and a couple of guests as high as 17 feet off of the ground. So now we had a mechanical system, a hydraulic system, and a safety system, and these all had to be fused into the original design for this ride.
Okay, so let me guess. When you start adding in the extra mechanisms that make Dumbo's ears flap, you're probably talking not here about like space age aluminum lightweight alloys. You're talking good old American cast iron in the 1950s, right? How much weight did this add to Dumbo?
Well, just remember, we're working math here and working backward. We only can afford 500 pounds. That's our total weight allowance. That means that includes the guests. And you can't reduce guests. Yeah, that was it. That's total. And so now 500 pounds, you take the amount of the guest weight out of that, and that leaves you with the boom arm, the vehicle weight, the mechanisms. And so you have a very tight window within which to work. So when you ask, you're speculating that the mechanism added a few pounds to the mechanism and the total like 50, weight 60, of the pachyderm. Yeah. It wasn't a few pounds. Try a bigger number. Try 200 pounds.
200 pounds for the flapping ear mechanism.
Mm-hmm.
40% of the overall vehicle weight for flapping ears. Yeah, I can see how this didn't make the cut. By the way, if the three of us had to go back to 1955 and hit a 500 pound weight limit on Dumbo, they'd have to make the ride vehicle out of paper mache.
There we go.
Literally, the ride could not get wet for us to be on it. Okay, 200 pounds.
200 pounds total for the total weight allowance.
Okay, so there's no way that the Imagineers could have built a car that would have gone to 700 pounds, right? That's just not part of the ride, right?
No, but it's the idea was sound. This is what they wanted. They knew at this point, this is what they wanted. Now, the only issue now was the question of who's going to build this, and for that, they turned to a small company, smallish company, that was located up in Mountain View, California. And we know them. They're famous. They're known as Aero Development.
Those guys, Carl Bacon, Ed Morgan, Bill Hardiman, and Angus Andy Anderson.
Oh, Hill, you're reciting these names like it was the 1927 Yankees over here playing with Babe Ruth.
They kind of are. I mean, these guys are basically the founding fathers when for the stuff that got built for theme parks back in the 50s and the 60s.
Really? And Jim Hill's not wrong. These guys are like the patron. They're on Mount Rushmore of ride designers and builders.
Wow.
When these four guys entered the business, they entered at the right time because it was just after the Second World War ended in August of 1945. And the people who worked at Aero Development, well, they came in just behind the first generation of ride makers. And so as those guys were getting ready to retire, now you had these new guys there in Mountain View, and they've been trained in the military. They were machinists. They knew how to build things. The war had ended. They were out of work. So they gathered together and said, well, how can we use our expertise in how we've been trained to earn a living? And so that's how Aero Development effectively started. Yeah, but, honestly, they may have bitten off a lot more than they could chew. Again, they're new in the business and they're building really new versions of rides that maybe had been based on a classic ride, but they were a new iteration. So these rides were all rocket science, and they frankly probably should have said no a few times, but they didn't. And it kind of came back to bite them, especially when it came time to building the Dumbo ride.
All right. I'm a sucker for behind the scenes story, Shull. What happened?
All right, let me lift the curtain. And to quote Robert R. Reynolds, he had a great book called Roller Coasters, Flumes, and Flying Saucers. And it's a book about the history of Aero Development. It was published back in April of 1999 by Northern Lights, and you could probably poke around and still find a copy. Anywho, what I'm repeating is what K.R. Bacon, the co-founder of Aero, told Mr. Reynolds. So to quote, Disney gave us so much work that honestly, we couldn't do it all. So we went outside our company. We hired another engineer, a new guy, to help us specifically with Dumbo.
Oh, and is that where the weight problem came in?
Yeah, well, that's probably where it came in, But, these overweight Dumbo cars, well, they were done. They were ready to be loaded onto the flatbed. And so they got shipped from Mountain View all the way down to Anaheim because they had to make Disneyland's opening day. But getting the Dumbos off the truck and into proper shape on the boom arms, tied into the hydraulic system and the control systems, getting them ready to accept the first guest, well, that whole process, for what we now call test and adjust, it took a lot more time than anyone ever expected. And that had consequences.
It did. Dumbo the Flying Elephant did not take off till August 16th, 1955. That's almost a full month after Disneyland first opened to the public.
Yeah, I did. But even when the park finally did get Dumbo off the ground, well, honestly, Fantasyland guests did not get an opportunity to even control their flying elephants, and they wouldn't, not for a while.
The joystick thing didn't work?
Oh, it did not work. It did not work. It did not work at all because it took a while to get that aspect of Dumbo's operating system to work properly, to get tied in the hydraulics to the operating system, and it took a long time. It took over a month. And up until that point, well, nobody wanted to ride a gray elephant that just, went in a circle on the ground. In order to get Dumbo up into the sky, it was the ride operator himself who actually had to press the big red button to get the vehicle to go up into the sky. The ride vehicle was controlled not by the guests at that point, but actually by the ride operator.
It sounds like it would be a blast for the cast members, but maybe not so much fun for the guests.
I think you are correct there. And okay, so this first month or so, then I'm assuming that this is when the guys from Aero Development are doing everything they can to shave a few pounds off of the pachyderms.
Oh, they did. They did everything. Now, and again, there's a huge hydraulic system. You've got hydraulic accumulators and pulsation dampeners because fluid is liquid. And when it travels from one elephant, it goes to the next. And you have to keep everything in relative balance. So, you do what you can. And, what they could do. Well, the first thing is they realized that those elephant ears were never going to flap. So they could shave a few pounds off by removing the mechanism, because that mechanism was a motor that was geared and controlled. And, that was a piece of, cast iron that they could take out of the head, and, give them a lobotomy, I guess. But so as a result, once you take the motor out, what you do is you're left with what? Well, you have a set of permanently locked in the level position ears in every single Dumbo. Now, it's not what they originally planned, but it did reduce the Dumbo weight.
All right, fair. That's a shame, though, because it sounded like a really super cool effect.
Irony here, though, is even without ears that flapped, Dumbo the Flying Elephant still proved to be an enormous hit with Disneyland visitors.
Yeah, which is kind of impressive in and of itself, because when you go back and look at the super early versions of the Fantasyland ride, like from the very early days, it's kind of pretty bare bones compared to what we have today.
Absolutely. I mean, it was bare bones and it was popular. Early on, the boom arms holding the individual elephant-shaped ride vehicles. Well, due to the press of time, because remember, they had to get the park open, and they're lucky to get the ride vehicles on the boom arms. There was no place in the schedule to paint the boom arms. So every one of those boom arms was a lovely shade of primer paint.
You like gray? How do you like gray?
Yeah,
gray is great.
What can we get it? Is Home Depot open?
Exactly.
Oh, and also Timothy Mouse and his disco ball, they're still backstage in the warehouse. Well, they'll get around to installing them at some future date. They came, but not for opening.
Yeah, we don't have time for frivolity, right? That's what they're saying. All right, so speaking of frivolity, Jim Shull, what is that fence made of in the background there?
Well, come on, it's only the finest of chain link fence. And actually, here's as a Floridian, you'll appreciate this. The brand was called Hurricane.
Hurricane, yeah,
Hurricane fence.
Was it stolen from a schoolyard? Because there's no polite way to say it. This looks rough.
It was rough. And, again, you got to go back and look at those old photographs. And what I love about it is when it opened, it was typical chain link, which means the galvanized wire just terminated, and that galvanized wire was sharp. Now, the park came back later and realized cut guests are not happy guests. So they started then to go and do a serrated piece of wood trim to cap all of that incredibly sharp wire that was, there mounted opening day on the perimeter fence around Dumbo.
So, I'm thinking here, had they left the razor sharp fence wire and let it rust over the winter in California, you could have done like a Dr. Tetanus's medical shots on Main Street just for like that added sense of realism. I don't know.
Well, there was a baby shop, I think, on Fantasyland. It didn't last. Maybe that wouldn't have been a good vendor to step in.
All right.
But the reason all of this was rough because Walt really needed to get his park opened. But there's a counterpart to that because this is the same Walt who was spending every single weekend living at the park in his little apartment over the Main Street firehouse. I mean, Walt's stories were legendary that, some maintenance guy would be working in the park in third shift after the park had closed, and he'd turn around and he'd see Walt Disney leaning over him with his notebook and saying, well, you left some gum over there, what about over here? And, oh, poor new walkway over here, and on and on and on, because you can't escape the boss when he lives in the business.
And, and eventually Dumbo came to Walt's attention. And so our chain link at some point, got replaced by a custom made picket fence, and Timothy came out from backstage with his whip, only now it's a magic black feather, right?
All right. So Shull, I mean, looking forward, where does Disney go with Dumbos? Do you think that we'll eventually see all the other parks that have a Dumbo get a double Dumbo like the Magic Kingdom did in Florida?
Okay, let me just throw another idea here on the pile. You know Bruce Gordon, right?
Oh, yeah, Bruce Gordon. He's a longtime show producer at WDI. He had his office there in Glendale, right next to Tony Baxter's. And I'd stop by and we'd talk all the time. Bruce, he had a long history with the company. He was responsible for Splash Mountain, Tarzan's Treehouse. Oh, and then, he and Dave Mumford, well, they collaborated on a lot of Disney books. In particular, Disneyland, the Nickel Tour, a postcard journey through a half century of the happiest place on earth. I was happy to contribute to developing design for that book. And I have my own signed copy right here on my bookshelf right behind me.
Oh, very cool. Thank you for bringing that book up, because in the epilogue that Bruce wrote for the Nickel Tour, he mused on what Disneyland might look like in 2055, the year that theme park celebrates its 100th anniversary.
I was going to say, Jim Hill, do you think park reservations will be necessary for that? But that was my first thought. But my second thought is this. So that's only like 31 years from now, right? Do you think that 31 years from now, the way the technology is going, that the Dumbos won't be on some boom arm? They'll be like Dumbo drones that actually fly?
Well, Bruce was a visionary, and I think he would be amused to see if that comes to be the case. But, when you need a visual reference, let's turn to this beautiful piece of art that's in the Nickel Tour. And it shows this classic Dumbo the Flying Elephant cars taking off over Fantasyland and then circling over the Sleeping Beauty castle. It's just like Bruce Bushman back in his day. Art and ideas, ideas start with lines on paper, and who knows how they mutate and morph until they become a reality.
That all sounds fantastic, Jim Shull. But one big question that remains, do you think in the year 2055 we'll have flapping Dumbo ears that will actually work?
Only if they can solve the hinge problem, Len.
All right. Well, I'll check back with you later on that. We've got some time. And speaking of checking back later, when we were developing this month's episode of Disney Impact, Mr. Shull, Mr. Hill, and I unearthed so much good Dumbo-related material that we're actually producing 2 carry-on episodes for September. I think you said the first one's going to look back at the career of Bruce Bushman?
This is true, the father of Fantasyland.
And then what's in the second carry-on episode for this month going to be about?
It's going to take a look at the Fantasyland that never was. We'll be talking about attractions that were developed for this part of Disneyland that just never made it off the drawing board. Like Alice in Wonderland, the walkthrough that used a classic amusement park funhouse as a starting point. We'll also be looking at things like Mickey and the Beanstalk slide. Oh, and also the Little Toot Canal boat ride. And let us not forget Pedro the Mail Plane Spinner. And finally, the Reluctant Dragon climbing structure.
Wow, that is a lot of Disney characters from the 1940s. Do you think a Disney park that was populated with so much IP from nearly 80 years ago would still resonate today with theme park guests that go now?
Well, actually, Len, that's 83 years ago this year, because Dumbo was released to theaters and theater goers in December 1941. I mean, we're talking our grandfathers. But, the reality is, that attraction, that little ride, that little flat spinner, it still pulls a line into all of the Disney parks all around the world. And it does that even without flapping its ears.
You have a point, Mr. Shull. And I have a pressing engagement with a martini. So we need to wrap this up. What is next for Disney Impact?
Well, next month, we're going to explore the work that Roots author Alex Haley did for Epcot's never-built Equatorial Africa Pavilion.
Oh, that's going to be a super fun show. I found some amazing material related to that World Showcase Pavilion when I was digging through the Buddy Baker archives at NYU a few years back, and also the University of Tennessee archives. And when does that episode debut?
That show will drop at the same time that all of our patron Disney Impact shows do, which will be on the first Sunday of every month, which in this case will be Sunday, October the 6th. So write it in your calendar right now.
And if you have any questions that relate to stories we touched on in today's show, well, feel free to send those along to contact@DisneyUnpacked.com, and we'll then answer your queries as part of this month's Disney Unpacked Q&A.
Awesome. Anything else, guys?
Well, let's see. In our anything else department, we'll be doing a Picture This episode later on this month. And in that episode, we'll be taking viewers from the Mickey Mouse Club Circus that was presented at Disneyland in the fall of 1955, only a few months after the park actually opened to guests, all the way through to Circus Fantasy, which occurred in the mid-1980s. This is when circus performers, they did really weird things in the park, like riding a motorcycle to the very top of the Matterhorn, not to mention getting fired out of a cannon. They flew over the rivers of America, and then they landed in a cargo net over on Tom Sawyer's Island, because, everyone goes to Tom Sawyer's Island to see Evel Knievel land in a cargo net. But stay tuned.
Okay, then. Until next month's show, this is Len on behalf of Jim Shull and Jim Hill, and we thank you for watching this episode of Disney Unpacked.